Demand is the sole cause of value. 13. It has been shown that materiality and durability are in no way necessary to value, but are only, in some cases, the accidents of value. It has also been shown that labor is not the cause of value, but is only, in some cases, the accident of value. But each of the quantities in the table of instances may be bought and sold, or their value may be exchanged in money. Each of them possesses the attribute of exchangeability, and that is the sole attribute which is common to all classes of the quantities, and to each separate quantity in each class. Hence, as the ancients unanimously held for 1300 years, exchangeability is the sole essence and principle of wealth. Thus, by strictly following the precepts of Bacon, by strictly rejecting and excluding all accidental and intrusive ideas, we have obtained an affirmative issue. Now, what is necessary in order that any quantity may be exchangeable? Evidently, that someone else should demand it. If I offer something for sale, what is necessary that it should be sold? Simply that someone else should desire or demand it. It is therefore manifest that demand is the sole cause of value. The author of the Euryxius over and over again points out that demand is the sole cause which constitutes anything wealth, that anything, whatever its nature may be, is wealth, so long as it is wanted and demanded, and no longer. He pointed out that the local money of different states is only wealth where it has power of purchasing, and is not wealth where it has no power of purchasing. It has been shown that the Greek word, insert Greek word, which is one of the most usual words for wealth, is derived from another Greek word, to want or demand, and that, insert Greek word, simply means anything that is wanted and demanded, and that things are only, insert Greek word, where they are, insert Greek word, or wanted and demanded, and that they are not, insert Greek word, where they are not, insert Greek word. The very same doctrine is laid down in Roman law. It is said that wealth is anything which is bought and sold, and for that reason, they class mere abstract rights, which are not associated with any material substance, as pecunia, res bona merx, because they can all be bought and sold, and the same doctrine holds in every system of jurisprudence. Here it is quite clear that we have obtained the true origin, cause, or form of value. It is demand, pure and simple. Value is not a quality of an object, nor is it the quantity of labor expended on obtaining it. It is an affection of the mind. When there is a demand for things, they have value. When the demand increases, the supply remaining the same, the value increases. When the demand decreases, the value decreases. And when demand altogether ceases, value is altogether gone. The ancients unanimously held that expia, Greek word, demand, is the sole cause of value. Aristotle says that it is expia, or demand, for each other's services which binds society together. Boyce Guilbert, the Morning Star of economics, saw this most clearly. He says, consummation, consumption or demand, is the principle of all wealth. All the revenues, or rather all the riches of the world, consist in consummation, demand. All the most exquisite fruits of the earth and the most precious products would be nothing but rubbish if they were not consommes, demanded. The Italian economists were very clear and consistent in showing that human wants and desires are the sole cause of all value. Genovese clearly points out that the words prizo, Slima or stima, valuta, valor are words of relation and not absolute, and that they are not applied to intrinsic qualities. That though money is the proximate measure, the ultimate measure to which not only things, but their price is referred, is man himself. Nothing has value where there are no men, and the very things which have a less value, where men are few, have a very high value, where there are many people, which is the reason why things and services have a much higher value in the capital than in the provinces. Men, however, do not give value to things and services unless they want them. Hence, our wants are the first source of the value of all things, and price is the power to satisfy our wants. Genovese says that nothing has value except in relation to these wants and demands. He shows how prices are always determined by supply and demand, and he says value is the child of demand. So, Beccaria says value is a substance which measures the estimation in which men hold things. Vera shows that it is the wants of men which give rise to commerce, and as their wants increase, so does commerce increase. Nations which increase their wants increase their power and their happiness. Desire or demand incites men to commerce. Commerce requires demand and abundance. Desire for the merchandise sought and abundance to give in exchange for it. And as a nation progresses from the few and simple wants of the savage state to new wants and necessities, it must proportionally increase its annual production so that it may have enough beyond its annual consumption to purchase foreign goods. They then require something to ascertain the equality between what they give and what they receive. Value is a word which denotes the estimation which men make of a thing. Vera also shows that all variations in price proceed from variations in supply and demand. The economists made all value proceed from demand. They showed that things which remain without demand, consummation, are without value. Condillac is very clear and explicit on the subject. He begins by investigating the foundation of the value of things and shows that it originates entirely from the want and desires of men. Things which satisfy some want have utility, and this want or estimation is called value. As people feel new wants, they learn to make use of things which they did not before. They give, therefore, value at one time to things to which at another time they did not. Hence, all value resides in the mind. And he says, this esteem is what is called value. And he shows that all variations in value proceed from variations in supply and demand. We have all shown that all ideas that labor is the cause of value are erroneous and to be rejected, and that demand is the sole cause of value. On the error of the expression intrinsic value, 14. We have now to say something about an expression which has been the cause of enormous confusion in economics, which has been one of the chief stumbling blocks in the apprehension of the subject of credit, and which must be cleared away. All ancient writers, without exception, clearly understood that the value of anything is some other thing external to itself, and there is not to be found in any of them the slightest trace of such confusion of ideas as the term intrinsic value. It is not easy to determine when the unfortunate expression intrinsic value came into use, but it seems to have arisen in this way. When unreflecting people thought about value, they thought of the quality of the thing which made it desirable, and they called that its value. They therefore gradually began to speak of intrinsic value. So long ago as 1696, an able writer, Barbon, pointed out the confusion which had arisen from mistaking the absolute qualities of an object for the quantity of things it would exchange for. He says, there is nothing which troubles this controversy more than for want of distinguishing between virtue and value. Value is only the price of things, and that can never be certain, because it must be there at all times and in all places of the same value. Therefore, nothing can have an intrinsic value. But things have an intrinsic virtue in themselves, which in all things have the same virtue, the lodestone to attract iron, and the several qualities that belong to herbs and drugs, some purgative, some diuretical, etc. But these, though they have great virtue, may be of small value or no price, according to the place where they are plenty or scarce. As the red nettle, though it be of excellent virtue to stop bleeding, yet it is a weed of no value from its plenty, and so are spices and drugs in their native soil of no value, but as common shrubs and weeds. But with us, of great value, and yet in both places of the same excellent intrinsic value. For these have no value in themselves. It is opinion and fashion. It is opinion, and fashion brings them into use and gives them a value. Barbon thus points his finger on the very phrase which is the bane of economics at the present day, the expression intrinsic value, which is to confound an intrinsic quality with an external relation. The following passage from Senior shows how easily even able men are beguiled into this error. He says, we have already stated that we use the word value in its popular acceptation as signifying that quality is anything which fits it to be given and received in exchange, or in other words, to be lent or sold, hired or purchased. So defined value denotes a relation reciprocally exchanging between two objects. Now, the quality of a melon which fits it to be sold is its agreeable flavor. Its flavor, therefore, according to Senior, is its value, and so defined. He says it means that it costs 5 shillings, or 5s. That is, he defines the quality of the thing to be its price. This is exactly the confusion which the economists carefully provided against. The quality which makes a thing desirable is its value in use, or its utility, and the economists repeatedly explained and declared that economics has nothing to do with value in use or utility, but only with value in exchange or market price. Smith, however, is the author who is chiefly responsible for the confusion of the subject in modern times. He begins by defining the value of a thing to be any other quantity it can purchase, to be something external to itself, and therefore that its value increases or decreases according as it can purchase more or less of that external thing. He then suddenly changes his idea of value. He then suddenly changes his idea of value and defines it to be the quantity of labor expended in obtaining the object itself. Thus, quantity of labor expended upon obtaining the object itself came to be held to be its value, and then value came to be called intrinsic. This unhappy phrase, intrinsic value, meets us at every turn in modern economics, and yet the slightest reflection will show that to define value to be something external to a quantity, and then to be constantly speaking of intrinsic value are inconsistent and self-contradictory ideas. Thus, over and over again, it is said that money has intrinsic value, and that a banknote or bill of exchange are only the representatives of value. Money, no doubt, is the produce of labor, But Smith himself says that if money could exchange for nothing, it would have no value. So he admits that exchangeability is the real essence of value. How then can the value of money be intrinsic? How can anything have intrinsic value unless it has a thing it will exchange for inside itself? Money will exchange for anything: lands, houses, corn, books, wine, jewelry, etc. And each of these is a value of money. But which of these is its intrinsic value? Money remains exactly the same in itself wherever it may be placed. A hogshead full of sovereigns has immense value in the middle of London. A hogshead full of sovereigns has immense value in the middle of London. But if a man had it by itself in a deserted ship in the middle of the ocean or in a barren island, where would its value be? Yet if it has intrinsic value in one place, it must have it equally in any other place. A banknote payable on demand is of the value of money. And why is it so? Simply because it is exchangeable for money. Hence, a banknote has value for exactly the same reason that money has, namely because it is exchangeable for something else. Credit is the right to demand money, and money is the right to demand something else. Socrates, in the Ergixius, shows that it is only when and where that money can be exchanged that it has value. When and where it cannot be exchanged, it has no value. So, where a banknote or a bill of exchange can be exchanged, it has value. When it cannot be exchanged, it has no value. Hence, the value of money and credits of all sorts is essentially of the same nature, though there may be different degrees of it. A credit, by the unanimous consent of all jurists, economists, and merchants, is an article of merchandise and an exchangeable commodity, just like money or any other material chattel. And this, whether it exists only in the abstract form of a mere right, or whether it be recorded on paper. The expression intrinsic value is so common that persons are apt to overlook its incongruity of idea. It is, however, a plain contradiction in terms, and if we use words of a similar import, but whose meaning has not been so corrupted in popular usage, its absurdity will be apparent at once. Thus, who ever heard of intrinsic distance or of an intrinsic ratio? The absurdity of these expressions is apparent at once, but they are in no way more absurd than intrinsic value. If we speak of the intrinsic value of money, we may just as well speak of the intrinsic distance of St. Paul's or the intrinsic ratio of 5. To say that money has intrinsic value because it is material and the produce of labor, and that a banknote is a bill of exchange, is only the representative of value, is just as absurd as to say that a wooden yard measure is intrinsic distance, and that the distance between 2 points 1 yard apart is only the representative of distance. A standard of value is impossible. 15. That unfortunate confusion of ideas between value, being the quantity of another commodity which any quantity will purchase, and the quantity of labor embodied, as it were, in the commodity itself, which is chiefly due to Smith and Ricardo, has not only led to that mischievous expression intrinsic value, the source of endless confusion in economics, but also to the search for something which very slight reflection would have shown to be impossible in the very nature of things, namely an invariable standard of value. It is as well to explain what these economists mean who are searching for an invariable standard of value. If we had a British yard and any foreign measures of length before us, we could at once perceive the difference between them. And if we were told the measurement of any foreign buildings, however remote in age and country, we could, by a very simple calculation, reduce them to the standard of British measurement and compare them with the size of our buildings. These economists who want an invariable standard of value want to discover and fix upon some single commodity by which they can compare the value of other things in all countries and ages. But the least reflection will show that such a standard is absolutely impossible by the very nature of things. Money is indeed termed the measure of value, and so it is in exchanges which are effected at the same time and place. If we are told that a quarter of corn is worth 40 shillings, and that a sheep is worth 40 shillings, at a certain time and place, we should say that they are then and there of equal value. But such matters are not the result of simple perception by the senses, as the different measures of length and capacity. If a quantity of gold were placed beside a number of other things, no human sense could discern what their value would be, and the most violent changes in their several values might take place in the market, without there being any visible sign of such a thing. Value is a mental affection, and values are not perceptible by ocular demonstration, but they must be declared by the communication of minds. Moreover, it is not possible to ascertain the different values of different quantities of gold obtained in different ages and countries. If a quantity of gold coin minted in the age of Augustus, an equal quantity minted in the reign of Elizabeth, and an equal quantity minted in China were placed side by side, what human sense could discern the difference in value between them? And yet, that is what these economists require, who want an invariable standard of value. They want something by which they can at once decide whether gold is of more value in AD Anno Domini 30, in AD 1588, or in AD 1888, in England or in China, without reference to anything else. But the only test of value is an exchange, and unless we can effect an exchange, there can be no value. How can we exchange an ounce of gold in the year AD 188 with one in the year AD 1588? Or with one in the year AD 1888? So 188, 1588, and 1888. Bailey well says, value is the relation between contemporary commodities, because such only admit of being exchanged with each other. And if we compare the value of a commodity at one time with its value at another, it is only a comparison of the relation in which it stood at these different times to some other commodity. It is not a comparison of some intrinsic independent quality at one period with the same quality at another period, but a comparison of ratios, or a comparison of the relative quantities in which commodities exchanged for each other at two different epochs. If a commodity A in the year 100 was worth 2B, and in 1800 was worth 4B, we should say that A had doubled its value to B. But this, which is the only comparison we could institute, would not give us any relation between A in 100 and A in 1800. It would simply be a comparison between A and B in each of these years. It is impossible for a direct ratio of value to exist between A in 100 and A in 1800, just as it is impossible for the relation of distance to exist between the sun at the former period and the sun at the latter period. The fact is that all this search after the impossible arose from Smith's unfortunate idea that the value of a thing is the quantity of labor bestowed on obtaining it, which was, as we have shown in the introduction, adopted by Ricardo. From this idea, it followed that if any commodity could always be obtained with an invariable quantity of labor, it would be an invariable standard of value. Ricardo admitted that there was no commodity which is always obtained by an invariable quantity of labor. And therefore, for that reason alone, he admitted that an invariable standard of value is unattainable. An invariable standard of value, however, is not only unattainable for the reason given by Ricardo, but it is in itself absolutely impossible by the very nature of things. Because value is a ratio, and a single quantity cannot be the measure of a ratio. The measure of length or capacity is a single quantity and can measure other single quantities, such as different lengths or bodies of capacity. But value is a ratio, and it is impossible in the nature of things that a single quantity can measure a ratio. It is impossible to say that A colon B colon X. It is manifestly absurd to say that 4 is to 5 as 8 colon without saying that 8 is what is to what colon, just as it is absurd to say that a horse gallops at the rate of 20 miles without saying in what time. But there may be a measure of value. 16. But though a standard of value is impossible by the very nature of things, there may be a measure of value. Value being the desire or demand of a person to acquire something else. The quantity of money he is willing to give to acquire it is the measure of his desire to obtain it, and therefore the measure of his value for it. But as credit is also evidently a measure of value, as well as money, neither a merchant nor anyone else will give more in credit, which he is bound to redeem in money to acquire any commodity, than he would give in money itself. But if he wants anything, he will give just as much in credit as he would in money. Hence, credit is equally a measure of value or desire with money. Hence, money and credit are the measure of value. And as it is universally admitted by all economists that purchases with credit affect prices in all respects equally with money, it follows that the aggregate of money and credit is the medium in which prices are measured, and that the aggregate of money and credit constitutes the circulating medium or currency, the medium in which prices are expressed. Value only exists in the human mind. 17. Value then, like color, sound, and odor, only exists in the human mind. There is neither color nor sound nor odor in external nature. They exist only in the human mind. According to the unanimous doctrine of ancient writers and all foreign economists, demand is the sole origin, cause, or form of value. It is demand or consumption, and not labor, which gives value to a product. It is not the labor which gives value to the product, but the demand for the product which gives value to labor. Hence, it is not labor which is the cause of value, but value which is the inducement to labor. It is not the labor of the producer which constitutes a thing, wealth, but the demand of the consumer. We conclude then that it is not labor, but consumption, exchange, or demand, which constitutes a thing wealth. And we trace the progress of a nation in wealth according as their wants and desires increase and multiply. First, the demand for the sustenance required by the body gives value to the material products of the earth: food, clothing, shelter, fuel. Then, as their tastes become cultivated and refined, arises the demand for works of literature, art, and science, for painting, for sculpture, for architecture, for the drama, for music. And those who minister to these wants of the mind become wealthy, just as those who minister to the wants of the body do. It is the demand of the public alone which makes these things wealth. Hence, in order to be wealthy, a people must be inspired with strong and various desires, to be willing to labor to gratify these desires. And this shows the great importance, in an economical point of view, of national education. Heavy taxes can only be borne by the industrious and wealthy people, and the multiplication of wants and desires multiplies industry, multiplies capital, multiplies incomes. multiplies the persons able to bear the burden of taxation, and renders the nation capable of great achievements and of taking a leading position in the councils of the world. Section 3, on the general law of value, or the general equation of economics, page 189, section 18, or paragraph 18. The last branch of our inquiry is to discover the general law of value, or the general equation of economics. That is, to discover a single general law which governs the changes in the exchangeable relations of all quantities, whatever their nature may be, at all times and in all places. The acknowledged principles of natural philosophy show that there can be only one general law of value, or a single general equation of economics. We have shown that there are three distinct species of economic quantities, and we have generalized all the fundamental concepts of economics so as to grasp all these quantities. These three orders of quantities can be exchanged in 6 different ways. Our present inquiry is to investigate a single general equation, which shall govern all these 6 species of exchanges indifferently. Suppose that we make the pound the general symbol of an economic quantity, i.e. of anything, whatever which can be bought and sold or exchanged, or whose value can be measured in money, or which has surprising power, and representing these various quantities under the general symbol pound. We may say that there are in any country quantities of this sort, etc., etc. Now we affirm, by virtue of the great principle of the continuity of science and of the great algebraic doctrine of the permanence of equivalent forms, that whatever can be proved to be true economically of any one of this series of quantities must be true of them all. Now, looking at the series of quantities placed above, who could tell of what species they are? Some may be land, some houses, some corn, some timber, some cattle, some jewelry, some money, some labor of all different sorts, some credit or debts, some the funds or other public obligations, some copyrights, some patents, some shares in commercial companies, etc. Now, as we have shown, that materiality, permanence, and labor are only accidentally associated in some cases with economic quantities and not with all, and that exchangeability is the only quality which is common to all economic quantities. It follows that materiality, permanence, and labor must be excluded from any general concept as an economic quantity, and exchangeability retained as its sole general quality. Having thus obtained these independent economic quantities, the whole purpose and object of the science is to discover the single general law which governs the variations of their exchangeable relations. It is clear that by the principle of the continuity of science and the analogy of all physical sciences, however varied and complicated, the different phenomena of value may be, there can, by no possibility, be more than one general law of value, or a single general equation of economics, whatever it may be. Fundamental conditions of the general equation of economics. 19, or paragraph 19. Now, let A and B be any 2 quantities, whatever supposed perfectly general. It is quite clear that their exchangeable relations are contained in the following limits. And thus a chart is inserted there. The meaning of which is simply this: let the exchangeable relation between A and B gradually and continuously change from where the greatest possible quantity of A will exchange for the least possible quantity of B, to where the least possible quantity of A will exchange for the greatest possible quantity of B. Now, the law of continuity says that a quantity cannot pass from one amount to another by any change of conditions without passing through all intermediate degrees of magnitude according to the intermediate conditions. Hence, we may affirm by virtue of the law of continuity, 1, that if it can be indubitably proved that any particular law is true at any one point in the range of prices, that same law must necessarily be true at all points throughout the whole range of prices. 2, that as the symbols A and B are perfectly general, if any law whatever can be proved to be true in the variations of the exchangeable relation of any two quantities whatever, that law must necessarily be true in the exchangeable relation of all quantities whatever. Thus, by the law of continuity, we are enabled to affirm that if any law whatever can be proved to be true at any one point in the range of prices between any two quantities whatever, that same law must necessarily be true at all points in the range of prices and between all quantities whatever. And as a necessary corollary from the preceding, we may affirm that if any law can be proved not to be true with regard to the relation of any two quantities whatever, that law cannot be a general law of economics. Furthermore, as it is a universally acknowledged principle of natural philosophy that that law only is the true one which explains all the phenomena, it may be laid down as an unquestionable truth in economics that if two or more forms of expression will explain or account for any phenomenon regarding price or the change of price, that form of expression only is to be adopted as the true one, which explains all the phenomena in the science, and not that individual case or class of cases only. Now, as we have shown in the introduction, that the Ricardo-Mill theory of value violates every one of these fundamental principles of natural philosophy, and as Mill himself says, that the laws of economics are to be formed by consciously and deliberately following the methods adopted in physical science. It follows that the Ricardo-Mill theory of value is to be utterly rejected, and we have now to investigate the true law of value, or the general equation of economics. Economics is a physical science because it is a pure science of causes and effects, there being 3 orders of exchangeable quantities and therefore 6 different kinds of exchange. The object of the science is to determine the laws of the phenomena of these exchanges. That is to determine the laws which govern the changes in their numerical relations of exchange. Hence, we have a new order of variable quantities, and the laws which govern this new order of variable quantities must be in strict harmony with the laws which govern the relations of variable quantities in general. The same general principles of reasoning which govern the relations of the stars in their courses must govern the varying relations of economic quantities. The fact is that astronomy is the physical science which is the type of economics. The fundamental problem of economics is identically the same as the fundamental problem of astronomy. The astronomer sees a number of quantities, the heavenly bodies, moving in all sorts of directions, sometimes advancing, sometimes apparently stationary, sometimes retrograding, and his object is to discover a single general law which accounts for and governs all these varying relations. So the economist sees a vast multitude of quantities constantly changing their numerical relations to each other, and his object is to discover a single general law which governs all these varying relations. Economics, like astronomy, is the pure science of ratios. Lord Lauderdale's Law of Value, 20. Now, how is the great general law of astronomy determined? In this way, let the heavenly bodies at any given instant be in any position. They then change their positions. The problem is to discover the law which governs these changes of relation. We must proceed in exactly the same way in economics. Let any number of economic quantities at any given time have any given relation to each other. They then change their relations to each other. Then the problem is to discover the single general law which accounts for and governs these changes of relation. Lord Lauderdale states the case in this way. Take any two quantities A and B, which may vary with respect to each other. First, let A remain constant while B varies. Then the relation of B to A will change from four causes. Then the relation of B to A will change from four causes. It would increase in value. Number one, from a diminution of quantity. Two, from an increase of demand. It would diminish the value. One, from an increase of quantity. Two, from a diminution in value. Now, as the variation of A with respect to B will be governed by exactly the same four causes, it is quite clear that the variation of both quantities will be governed by 8 independent causes. And if these be connected in the form of an equation, that will manifestly be the true general law of value, or the true general equation of economics. Thus, Lord Lauderdale has the credit of having established the true general equation of economics. This comprehends the whole science of pure or analytical economics, exactly as the great law of Newton's governs the relations of the heavenly bodies. And as it is in the form of a fraction containing no less than 8 independent variables, it at once shows the supremely complicated nature of the science. This complicated equation is the full expression of what is popularly known as the law of supply and demand. All economists admit that it is true when the prices of things are very low. They also admit that it is true when the prices of things are very high. They therefore admit that it is true at the extremes of prices. And therefore, as it is true at the extremes of prices, the law of continuity affirms that it is necessarily true at all points in the range of prices between the extremes. That is, that it is universally true, and therefore, that it is the true general law of value, or the true general equation of economics. Remarks on the general equation of economics, 21. The general equation of economics is, therefore, a compound ratio of a complicated nature, and to apply it in particular cases requires a profound knowledge of the circumstances of the case, and yet it is demonstrably true. And the whole science must be construed taking that equation as the basis. In obtaining this general equation, we have followed the method invariably used in all physical science. We have obtained the independent variables and connected them in a general law or formula. This ensures certainty to the science, but it is on the last point that the real difficulty arises, namely in giving precision or numerical amounts to the coefficients. It is absolutely impossible to say what numerical variations in supply and demand produced. It is absolutely impossible to say what numerical variations in supply and demand produce definite variations in value. This has been attempted in some cases, as in that of corn, but it is manifestly impossible to obtain exact numerical data. And in fact, though the same general law is true in all cases, it is perfectly well known that it varies in every particular case. And the same absolute variations in the supply and demand in various quantities will produce great differences in the variations of their numerical values. It is this impossibility of giving exact numerical value to the coefficients that makes many persons suppose that it is impossible to make economics an exact science. It is sometimes supposed that for a science to be an exact one, it is necessary that its laws should be capable of exact quantitative statement. This, however, is an error which has been specially pointed out by Comte, who, well, shows the difference between certainty and precision in science. To constitute an exact science, it is not necessary that its laws can be ascertained with numerical precision, but only that the reasoning be exact or certain. He says that a dangerous prejudice has sprung up, that because the precision of different sciences is very unequal, that certainty is too. This tends to discourage the study of the most difficult. Precision and certainty are perfectly distinct. An absurd a proposition may be very precise, as that the angles of a triangle are equal to 3 right angles. On the other hand, a certain proposition may not be precise, as that a man will die. Hence, though the different sciences may vary in precision, that will not affect their certainty. This observation applies most forcibly to economics. Some persons are apt to despise it because it does not bring out its results with the same precision as mathematics. This, however, is a grievous mistake. In economics, the causes of phenomena can be ascertained with absolute certainty. And if we want to produce any given effect, the method of producing it can be pointed out with absolute certainty. This is all that is necessary to constitute economics an exact science. Because the method of producing a required result being pointed out with absolute certainty, it has only to be put in force until the result is produced. In considering the general equation of economics, we see the application of Bacon's aphorism, that which in theory is the cause, in practice, that which in theory is the cause, in practice is the rule. No other quantities but demand and supply appear on the face of the equation. It is therefore certain that no other causes influence value or changes of value except intensity of demand and limitation of supply. It is certain that neither labor nor cost of production have any direct influence on value. It can only be by affecting the demand or the supply, and that no change of labor or of cost of production can have any influence on value, unless we produce a change in the relation of supply and demand. By this means, we are enabled to create a rigorously exact theory of economics, and by reverently following the precepts of the mighty prophet of inductive philosophy and the examples of the immortal creators of the various inductive sciences, it is seen that economics as a moral science is fitted to take rank with mechanics and optics as a great positive inductive physico-moral science, and it is the only moral science capable of being raised to the rank of an exact science. In interpreting, however, the general equation of economics, it is necessary to make one observation. It is sometimes supposed that value is only affected by the actually existing quantity of produce which is brought into the market. This, however, is not so. The expected quantity which may be brought into the market has a most important influence on the value of the existing quantity. If there was a general failure of the coming crops, that would exert a most potent influence on the present value of the existing stock of corn. Or if prices had been very high in consequence of great scarcity of supplies and of the coming harvest promised to be very abundant, that would exercise a very potent influence in diminishing the value of the present stock. Hence, the word quantity in the general equation must denote the quantity actual or expected. Similarly, the word demand must denote the demand actual or expected. Chapter 3, the theory of credit. Origin of the system of credit in Europe. Number 1. If we were asked how that wonderful people, the Romans, commencing with a petty village, gradually extended their empire over so large a portion of the world, it would probably be said that it was due to their hardihood and their discipline. But probably a cause which has been entirely overlooked contributed in no slight degree to the result, and that is their wonderful and methodical habits of business. The Romans were, as far as we are aware, the creators of the great system of credit in all its branches. When the practice of writing became common at Rome, it was established as a custom or law that every dominus, or head of a house, should keep a family ledger, as strict and exact as those of a modern banker. In this, he was obliged to enter all sums of money borrowed and lent, all trade profits and losses, and these family ledgers were the only legal evidence of debt among Roman citizens receivable in the courts of justice. And it was from these family ledgers that the whole of the modern system of bookkeeping and credit has been developed. It seems that every occurrence was noted down day by day in a wastebook termed adversaria, and at the end of the month, the various items were arranged under their proper heads in the ledger, which was termed tabula, or codex accepti a expensi, which was intended to be preserved as an heirloom in the family. Every 5 years, the dominus was obliged to swear to the truth of the codex before the censors, and it was regarded almost with a species of sanctity. A great difference was made between the adversaria and the codex. Cicero says he acknowledges that he has not the sum entered in his ledger codex, but he insists that it is entered in his day book, adversaria. Are you then so fond of yourself and have such an exalted opinion of yourself as to sue for money, not on the evidence of the ledger, but of your day book? It is arrogant to bring forward your ledger instead of witnesses. But is it not madness to bring forward your own scraps of writing and notes? If these notes have the same force and weight and authority as the ledger, what is the use of making a ledger? To make entries in it? Or to keep it in regular order? Or to make a permanent record of old writings? But if we have an established custom to make a ledger because we put no trust in notes, is that to be considered of weight and approved before a judge, which we ourselves consider weak and unreliable? Why is it that we write notes without much care and we write the ledger with great care? Because the one is to last a month and the other is to last forever. The former are soon erased and the others are preserved with religious care. The former preserve the memory for a short time. The latter pledge the good faith and honesty of a man forever. Notes are thrown away. The ledger is kept in order. Therefore, nobody produces notes in evidence in a cause, but they do produce the ledger and read the entries. This family ledger was kept in or near the arca, the chest or safe in the tabulum, or apartment opposite the door of the atrium, or central hall of the Roman house, where all the records and archives are kept. The system of credit. Number 2. The great system of credit comprehends 1. The creation of obligations, 2. The transfer of credits or debts, 3. The extinction of obligations, which will be fully discussed in the following sections. The Roman jurists completely worked out the juridical principles of credit, and these are sufficient for all practical purposes. But they are not sufficient for the full scientific theory of the subject. For they regarded the subject chiefly from the creditor's point of view and only slightly from the debtor's. But every obligation has two sides, the creditors and the debtors, the active and the passive, or the positive and the negative. Accordingly, for the last 150 years, from the days of Maclaurin, mathematicians have been in the habit of terming debts negative quantities. But very few have given any explanation of what they mean by terming a debt a negative quantity. And those who have done so from a want of knowledge of the principles of mercantile law and the facts of commerce have entirely failed in giving an explanation which can be received as suitable for economic science. If the subject had been handled by mathematicians who were trained in mercantile law and practical business, there never would have been the slightest difficulty. But unfortunately, it has been treated by literary and mathematical writers who were entirely deficient in the necessary knowledge, and they have fallen into a series of errors which are fully provided for in the digest and in every continental treatise on jurisprudence. It is well known that although mathematicians have been in the habit of using the algebraic signs or their equivalents for 1600 years and have given the empirical rules for their combination, it is only within the present century that their scientific principles have been thoroughly understood. We must therefore explain the modern theory of algebraic signs and their application in mathematics and physical science, and then give an exposition of the principles of mercantile law in the facts of commerce, and then discover the interpretation of these signs which is suitable for the particular circumstances of economics. The doctrines of the Roman jurists are, of course, expressed in words, but we shall find that jurists working separately, algebraists working separately, and the practice of mercantile men acting separately and independently from their own instincts, are all in perfect harmony with each other. And when we fuse these three together, an exposition of the facts of commerce, an exposition of the juridical theory of credit, and show the application of the theory of algebraic signs to these facts of commerce and the juridical principles of credit, we shall find the most beautiful exemplification of the use of these signs, strictly in accordance with their use in mathematics and physical science. It is too often the custom to consider the system of credit as pure haphazard empiricism. The following sections will show that this is an entire error, and that the whole system may be reduced to the strictest scientific demonstration. We shall be able to carry the theory of credit to a greater state of perfection than it was left in by the Roman jurists, by removing an obscurity which has puzzled jurists and divines for centuries. And we shall be able, for the first time, to bring economic theory to the level of mercantile practice. On the method of contracting a loan among the Romans. Number 3. For many centuries, the Romans divided property into two classes according to the manner by which it might be alienated, sold, or transferred. That species of property which they first possessed and were first accustomed to consider as the patrimony of the house, or domus, they termed res mancipi, and this could be only transferred by certain very strict formalities. Other property which they held in less esteem at first, or which they acquired afterwards, might be transferred by simple delivery. This kind of property was termed res nec mancipi. The list of property classed as res mancipi was formed in the earliest ages of the Republic and was never extended beyond its first limits. All new species of property was classed under res nec mancipi. Thus, the money of the early Romans was copper, and accordingly, copper money was included under res mancipi. But gold and silver money were of much later introduction, and they were classed under res nec mancipi. Rural servitudes in Italy were classed as res mancipi, but the rights of obligations, as well as all other incorporeal property, were classed as res nec mancipi. The sale or alienation of a res mancipi could only be effected by certain very strict formalities, which were necessary to ensure a good title, in an age when written conveyances were unknown. This form of sale was termed mancipium or mancipatio. Gaines says that it was effected in the presence of 5 witnesses, Roman citizens of all age, and also in the presence of another citizen who held the pair of bronze scales, and hence called libri pens. The purchaser, holding a bronze ingot, said thus, "I say that this man is mine by the common law of the Romans, and that he is bought by me with this bronze ingot and bronze scales. He then struck the scales with the ingot and gave it to the seller by representing the price. As has been shown, every loan of money is a sale, in which the property in the money is ceded to the borrower. The money thus ceded was called a mutum, because it was given in exchange for the right to demand an equal sum at a future time. As eis was a res mancipi, every loan of money required to be made by the mancipium, or the sale, per eis a libram. But the right of the obligation was a res nec mancipi, and therefore it might be transferred in other ways. The bond of law created between these two parties by the sale or loan of the mutum by the formality of the eis a libra was termed a nexus us. And nexus was the only term used in the time of the 12 tables in the year 451 BC to denote a contract or obligation. In course of time, the cumbrious form of the weight and scales were dispensed with, and a contract or obligation could be created by simpler methods. These were the obligatio re, the obligation which was created by the loan or advance of the thing itself, the obligatio verbis, or the verbal contract termed stipulatio, the obligatio literis, or the written contract created by entries in the family ledger. And finally, the obligatio consensu, or the obligation created by mutual consent without any formalities. And the footnote reads, it has long been the habit of jurists to use the term nexus and nexum indiscriminately to mean a contract or obligation. But Professor H. Nettleship of Oxford has shown that nexus means the abstract incorporeal contract, and nexum, the material object to which it refers. On the stipulatio, or verbal contract. Number 4. The stipulatio, or verbal contract, was made by solemn question and answer in the presence of witnesses. It was the most extensive form of making a contract in Roman law, and all other contracts might be transferred into a stipulation. Supposing that the stipulatio was employed to create an obligation or contract of debt, the lender delivered the sum lent to the borrower and asked him a question of this sort. Do you promise to deliver to me such a sum at such a time? The borrower answered, I do. And thus the contract or obligation was created. It is said in the Institutes that stipulatio was derived from stipulus, an old word for firm, certain, ascertained, which perhaps may come from stips. The person who asked the question was called stipulator, or reus stipulandi. The person who answered was called promittor, or reus promittendi. The stipulatio, or contract by question and answer, could only form a unilateral contract, or one in which one party is bound. If a bilateral or synalagmatic contract was to be created, it was necessary to perform two stipulations. Several examples of stipulatio occur in Plautus, as in asinior, Pseudolus, Curculio, Bach, Trinumus, Rudens, etc. The marriage service of the Church of England is an example of a bilateral contract affected by two stipulations. The priest says to the man, wilt thou have this woman to be thy wedded wife? The man answers, I will. The priest says to the woman, wilt thou have this man to thy wedded husband? The woman says, I will. And by these two stipulations, the bilateral contract of marriage is created. On Arcaria Nomina, number 5. It was the duty of every Roman dominus, or head of a house, to make an entry of every sum borrowed or lent in his ledger, or codex, accepti e expensi. If therefore he had lent a sum of money by any of the methods of making a loan, the creditor would duly enter it in his ledger at the end of the month. When he had made this entry, it was termed ar carium nomen. And the debtor, of course, was bound to make a correlative entry in his ledger. But such an entry as this in the creditor's ledger was not the contract. It was only evidence of the contract. The contract was created by the actual advance of the money. It was, of course, absurd to suppose that any person could create another person his debtor by simply making an entry against him in his ledger. Cicero says that it is equally base for a man to make a false entry of money lent in his ledger as not to make an entry of money borrowed. On the obligatio literis or written contract. 6. But an actual contract or obligation might be made by an entry in the ledger. The borrower came to the lender, and in the presence of witnesses, the lender advancing the money said to the borrower something of this sort. Have I weighed out and given you 100 aeri? The borrower said, you have weighed them out and given them to me. The creditor then, with the consent of the debtor, made a formal entry of the loan in his ledger, which was termed expensilatio. The corresponding entry in the debtor's ledger acknowledging the receipt of the money was termed acceptilatio. An entry of money lent made in the creditor's ledger with the consent of the debtor was absolutely conclusive and could not be questioned. It formed a valid contract, whether the money had actually been advanced or not. If an action was brought for the money, the judge could make no inquiry into the actual facts. The solemn entry made with the consent of the debtor was equivalent to a stipilatio. The creditor made an entry of pecunio expensia lata, or money advanced in his ledger. The debtor made a correlative entry of pecunia excepta relata, or money received in his ledger, and thus the obligatio literis, or written contract, was constituted. The obligatio consensu, or consensual contract. 7. In the year 469 AD, the Emperor Leo abolished the strict formalities of the stipulation and enacted that a consent given in any form should be valid if the parties agreed about it. There was no necessity for any writing or witnesses. As an example of a consensual contract, we may give the customs of trade when any person enter into a trade or have dealings with traders. There are certain well-known and recognized customs of trade, which, though they may be unwritten, are legally valid, and the persons of that trade and all those who deal with them give a consent to be bound by them.